particularly thrilled to welcome Professor Roger Trigg. He's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from the University of Warwick and currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Ian Ramsay Centre, which is at the University of Oxford, and he was formerly the head of that. He has a long and distinguished career in philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. He has authored numerous books. He's been co-director of a major project on cognitive science of religious belief, and he's the founding president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion. And I could go on, and probably I'll just stop there. He can tell us anything else that I've missed off that's pertinent to him today. He has actually a book coming out, unfortunately, just a month too late for being on the bookstalls at this conference, on religious diversity from philosophical and political perspectives. Roger's going to be giving 2 lectures to us this weekend. The first one tonight is really going to, if you like, open up the subject of philosophy, science and faith by looking at rationality in science and faith. And then later on tomorrow afternoon, he's going to be speaking about cognitive science.
Right, now I want to talk about the whole question of rationality in both science and faith. Immediately, of course, some people would say, rationality in faith? Of course, there's no such thing. How often do we hear faith on the one hand, reason on the other? And faith isn't a matter of reason, it's just a matter of faith. Sometimes that's said from the religious side even, but sometimes it's said as a matter of criticism. I mean, you can't argue with religious people. You can't deal with religion in public life. One of the things that I've been particularly concerned with in recent years is the place of religion in public life and ongoing issues to do with religious freedom and respect for religious people. So often, the reaction from so many people is that actually religion is something that's so irrational, or at least irrational, something that's so impossible to get hold of, and so therefore potentially dangerous, that it has to be put into the private area. It's privatized. Religion is all right as long as it's kept in certain buildings on a Sunday morning or Friday or Saturday. You mustn't let it out in the street. And anything that smacks of religion in public life is a threat to the order of society. Now, one of the reasons for people saying that is precisely because they think religion is not concerned with reason. You can't get hold of religious arguments. You can't discuss them. Now, that's something that I want to rebut, absolutely. That I think that religion is as much in the business of claiming truth, and therefore it has the risk of perhaps saying things that are wrong. It's as much in the business of claiming truth as, in fact, is science. Now that, of course, is going to be heresy in some quarters. Just think how Richard Dawkins, you don't get very far in talking about this kind of topic without his name coming up. He's been so successful in selling his books. But anyway, just think how he talks about the need for evidence. And what he means by evidence is what scientists here and now count as evidence. Not even what science one day might. It's what here and now is counted as evidence. And therefore, reason and evidence and justification is narrowed down to what contemporary science can cope with. Everything else is to be discarded. Now, there are philosophical backgrounds to this. So let me just mention 2. The first, chronologically, is pragmatism. And I suppose you could say, well, that can be summed up by just saying, well, science works. I mean, how often have I come across people who said, well, science works, so that's the end of it. Religion, perhaps, you can't see how that works, but science does. It gives us non-stick frying pans and gets us to the moon, and etc., etc. Might threaten to destroy the planet, but that's another issue. But nevertheless, science works, and therefore should be respected for that reason. And in a way, that's a kind of pragmatist argument. Pragmatists don't want any truck with metaphysics. I want to be talking a little bit about metaphysics tonight. What I mean by metaphysics is, well, I suppose what Aristotle meant was it was what came after physics. And here's what he was writing. It was the subject matter of what, in fact, is beyond physics, what physics can't cope with, the framework in which physics and all science takes place. And one of the battles nowadays, in fact, is that people can't accept that science needs an external framework to support it, that science itself needs an external justification. Science, it's thought, because it works, is its own justification. Philosophy, even, is something that may be allowed within science to clarify the terms used by science. It shouldn't be something that can stand in judgment on science. It soon gets us into highfalutin areas where you can't settle anything, there's no settled procedure. What we need is agreed scientific method. We know what that is. We know how to separate what's true and what's false scientifically. You can't do that if you deal with metaphysics. There is a well-known story, I mean, I don't know how well-known it is nowadays, but it comes in William James' writings. He was on a camping trip out in the wilds, upstate New York, I think it was, and he went back to the campsite and found a furious argument going on amongst his friends. They'd been looking at a grey squirrel. Now, there are lots of them around here too. And one of the things about grey squirrels is they like climbing trees, and if they see you and you try and circle the tree, they'll circle the tree as well and keep you and the tree, well, the tree is between the squirrel and you. In other words, you go round like that. You go round the tree, the squirrel goes round the tree. Now, the argument that William James' friends had was quite simply, if you go round the tree while the squirrel is going round the tree, are you going round the squirrel? Now, William James got a bit impatient with this, because in the end, more or less, his reaction was, what on earth does it matter? He explained that it was a purely verbal dispute and it depended how you described the situation. And he said, really, metaphysics is like that. If it doesn't get a grip on the real world, if it doesn't make a difference, then what's the point of it? You can discard it. And that's one of the hard-headed kind of approaches to metaphysics. It's airy-fairy, it doesn't deal with what we're here talking about here and now. It makes no difference to how we live our lives. And indeed, that's a typical pragmatist question. What difference does it make? And if you can say, well, it doesn't make any difference, we can say, well, it's just a purely linguistic argument. That's all we need bother about. And, you know, you can call it what you want, but nothing hangs on it. And I suppose a good philosophical question is always, well, what hangs on it? But you can define that too narrowly. So pragmatists are against metaphysics. Now, there's another strand in the 20th century that actually also puts its, nails its colours to science. And those are the logical positives stemming from the Vienna Circle of the 1930s in Vienna. One or two of them came to a sticky end. I remember actually standing on the steps of the university in Vienna and somebody saying that was where Schlick was assassinated. Schlick was one of the members of the Vienna Circle, but I think it was an irate graduate student who got him. But anyway, I don't suppose it was particularly to do with his philosophical views. But anyway, but the views were very controversial. And basically what the Vienna Circle was putting forward was what they termed the scientific world conception. In other words, everything is based on science. Science sets the standard for what's true. If you can't verify something, in other words, if you can't check its truth, you don't know what it means. And so the verificationists even tied meaning, not just truth, to the question of how do you set about falsifying or verifying what you're talking about. When I was an undergraduate in Oxford and then a graduate, I was taught by A.J. Ayer. Now, he was really the apostle of logical positivism in this country. He popularized it in this country after the war. And I remember once getting in terrible hot water with him in a seminar because I had the temerity to say, aren't there levels of existence? Which was absolutely anathema. Up he went. I'd been reading too much Plato, I suppose, but nevertheless, I mean, still, actually, on reflection, I think it wasn't as bad a question as he made out. But for him, he's not going to deal with levels of existence, metaphysics, anything like that. What you can't verify is meaningless. The Veyana Circle had a very nice line about this. There are no insoluble issues, because if you can't solve them scientifically, it isn't a genuine issue. And it's a very quick way with dealing with all of the problems of life. And again, look at what the implied question is. How do we verify? Well, it's how we know we can verify now according to present-day science. I think one of the things that showed that the verifications were going rather wrong was that when I started out in philosophy, and this is really going to date me, they were worried about the other side of the moon. Now, at that point, no one had ever seen the other side of the moon. It was only a few years before they did. Now, admittedly, they said, well, actually, of course, in principle, it can be seen. But nevertheless, the very fact that they raised the question showed that there was a very great issue about what do we do with things we can't verify. Now, of course, very quickly, physics has developed. In fact, it had developed at that stage far beyond that. So you've got, I'll talk more about other branches of physics in a minute, but quantum mechanics itself was dealing with microscopic entities that seemed to be beyond the bound of verification. And indeed, a lot of the arguments about the interpretation of quantum mechanics revolve around the question about can we talk about real entities if they can't be properly verified scientifically. But again, the fact that the issue seems to be an issue shows that verification, and then later on Karl Popper turned it round more to falsification, but those issues were of central importance. So logical positivism was saying, again, everything that can't be verified scientifically is meaningless. And this actually dealt pretty quickly with a lot of human experience, ethics, aesthetics, religion, certainly anything metaphysical, and indeed anything, therefore, that stood outside science that might justify science. Now, one of the questions that I want to leave with you tonight is the question, what has to be the case for science to be successful? And I don't think it's good enough to say, well, it works, it is successful, or that's what we do, or it's Western science is how we think. I mean, that's a sociological thing. We need some kind of metaphysical justification. In other words, you need to stand outside science. I'll come back to that issue again. But at the moment, we are confronted, I suppose, not so much with a verificationism, because people have seen the holes in that, but as a science-based philosophy that isn't so far off that. The classic argument against verificationism is, how do you verify the truth of the verification theory of meaning? In other words, it's not a bad trick, actually, to always turn arguments on themselves and say, well, if you refer it to itself, does it undermine itself? And if it does, you've got a problem, I think. But the verification theory of meaning, obviously, is not something that can be scientifically verified, nor can, if you just say verification theory of truth. I remember once asking Ayer what his answer to this was, and he said, oh, well, he said, it's an axiom. Now, axioms, I think, are starting points, but you don't have to have a particular axiom if it rules out too much. So it doesn't actually justify the axiom, I don't think. I mean, it's really not a very substantial place to be standing, particularly when, as scientists have quickly found, the verification theory just can't cope with modern-day physics. I'll get into the wilder areas of physics in a moment, but just think even just of the interior of a black hole. It's not unreasonable, theoretically, to talk about that as if it has a reality, yet it's not something that's conceivably possible to verify. So, and I think one of the tricks about this is that verification is an epistemological idea. I don't want to use too many philosophical words here, but I want to distinguish between epistemology, how we know things, things from metaphysics, the nature of the things that we know. In other words, knowledge is one thing, reality is another. And if you notice with the verification theory, what they were doing was saying what there is how we as humans can find it out. But that's changing the subject. What the world is like, how we define the world, isn't dependent on our ability to find it out. What it's like for us may be, in fact, well, it's trivially true. What it's like for us is what we can think it is. But we're not omniscient, and science can develop, and perhaps one of the motives for progress in science is to think that it's going towards a reality that we can't altogether grasp. In some ways, the word transcendence is not inappropriate here. That reality is something that exists in itself. It's something that does not depend on our knowledge. Another way of putting it is not anthropocentric. Why should it be? In fact, if you push that line too much, you get from realism, which is what I'm upholding, the idea that there is a reality that's independent of us. You turn it round to saying reality is totally dependent on us, and you get to Berkeley's view, minus God perhaps, that to be is to be perceived. In other words, the mind creates reality. And that makes reality anthropocentric. I think it narrows the nature of what there is in quite an astonishing way. Now, I said that the verification theory was science-based. It talked about the scientific world's conception. And although many people wouldn't want to talk about verificationism as such nowadays, they'd be quite embarrassed about doing so, because it can't deal with theoretical entities in science. I think that's the basic reason. Nevertheless, I think that there are many people who want to say that somehow the limits of reality are set by science. And that can fly under various isms which are related in a way. There's the classic one, materialism, all that exists is matter, and that's always related to the notion of science and how science can find out things. That's got less popular in more recent years because I think it's very hard even for scientists to define what is matter. It's much easier when they're all kind of hard little atoms, particularly when you were dealing with people like Lucretius in ancient Rome, talking about atoms colliding and so on. But the minute you start splitting the atom and then going down and down, matter seems to dissipate into energy, and it gets very difficult to say what you mean by this matter. So, another popular word is physicalism. What there is what ultimately physics tells us. And again, you see that's really centering reality on physics, which in physics is what humans do. So again, you've got this anthropocentric element coming in, that physics is related to reality, almost in the sense of constructing it, but that can't be right. Things can only be right scientifically because they reflect reality. We discover reality, we do not, in fact, construct it. One problem many people have with the term physicalism is that it does actually emphasize physics very much. And there is quite a reductionist tone to that. In other words, everything has to be reduced down, so psychology goes down to biology, which goes down to chemistry, which goes down. In the end, everything is really physics, and without remainder. And I mean, it's a good thing if you're a physicist, because actually you're saying that actually all the rest of science is really, if it's going to be anything, it has to take physics seriously and be reduced to physics. So it's kind of imperialism. You notice that, in fact, in academic life, everybody's trying to take over everybody else's discipline. And physicalism is a good gambit by the physicalists to say actually all the other scientific disciplines are all froth on the top of physics. But because it prioritizes physics, another word that I think this is more the word that's in vogue at the moment, is naturalism. In other words, this says that what there is somehow what is natural, now whatever that means. And part, I think, of the problem with that is that there is a slide from two things. Methodological naturalism. I mentioned scientific method before now. Science depends on a particular method. There's no doubt about that. Science depends on, in a sense, putting blinkers on and saying we're looking for cause and effect, we're looking for physical causes of some kind. It isn't an answer to a problem to say, well, the fairies did it at the bottom of the garden. It may not actually be an answer to say too readily that God did it, because that could be introducing the God of the gaps and just filling in what is at the moment a piece of ignorance on our part. So naturalism is saying actually everything ought to be looked at in a scientific way, and science can explain it. Now, I said that there's a slide because science as a methodology obviously has to keep very much to a particular way of looking at things: observation, experiment, agreement. I mean, one feature about science is that science ought to be the same everywhere. When I was in Warwick, I remember our Vice-Chancellor, who was a biologist, getting very cross with my philosophy department, which unfortunately at the time was rather split between analytic and continental philosophers. And he said very loftily, in science there's no such thing as continental science, or English science, or Anglo-Saxon science. It's just science. And there's a truth there. Science is universal. What is discovered in Beijing is valid in Washington, D.C. What's valid in Washington, D.C. ought to be noticed in Cambridge. So all of these things are true. Science is universal. It's one thing, of course, why it's thought to be a particularly good example of human rationality, if not the only example of human rationality. Science aspires to universality, and so, of course, should anyone who's rational about anything. People won't always agree, and the fact that people disagree doesn't mean that you're wrong or they're wrong necessarily. I think sometimes actually people do compare, say, science and religion in a little bit of an unfair way, because they say, well, look, everybody agrees that water is H2O, and look at all the disagreement about the nature of God. So they go from something very simple to something very complicated. But if you look at the frontiers of science, I'm going to give an example in a minute, there's very, very great disagreement. And perhaps people would say, but we know in principle how to resolve it. But there is disagreement, and it goes pretty deep. So I don't think the fact that people disagree means that there isn't a truth there. People can have deficient information, or sometimes they can be willfully stubborn, in science as well as elsewhere. So, truth and our methods of finding it out are different, but methodological naturalism is talking about methods, and then we suddenly split and go into metaphysical naturalism. And you find that people say that science is the only way to find out this and that, and the only things that exist is what science can find out. And there's suddenly a jump. You're limiting what can exist by the capabilities of human science. Now that's a metaphysical naturalism. And I'm not going to here and now say it's wrong. What I'm going to say is it needs argument. And you're not arguing about it within science. That is not a scientific statement to say that the only things that in fact are real are things that can be found out by science. It's a statement made from outside science and needs philosophical argument. That irritates, of course, many physicists. It was Stephen Hawking who, in a recent book, said that philosophy is just finished, it's a delusion, it can't contribute anything, and he then went on to write subsequent chapters on very basic philosophical issues, such as is there a reality to be discovered. But nevertheless, in the end, beware of saying, yes, this is the methodology in science, and then going on to say, therefore, that's the only possible way to find out truth. That needs an argument. And it's something that we very often find a slide from one to the other. Now, I've been talking about theoretical entities. I mentioned the interior of black holes. And I think one of the characteristics of contemporary science, and I mean very contemporary science and physics, is that theory is getting more and more distant from observation and experiment. It's one of the fascinating things about cosmology, which I'd like to just take as a brief example. I talked earlier about how, when I was young, people were worried about the other side of the moon. We haven't verified it. How can we talk about it? Well, we can talk about it in principle. And I'm always worried about that phrase, in principle. I mean, in that case, it was only a few years before it actually was observed and the technology was being developed then. So we can see what was meant. But how far on do you go? I mean, pragmatist, talked about the scientific millennium, when, in fact, all the facts are in, and so he was thinking of an ideal science. I think very often it looked as if he was thinking the ideal science was a science that reflects reality as it is. But that's taking reality as prior, rather than just science, because an ideal science might be so very different from our present-day science that to talk about science may not be very enlightening here and now. So, what about theoretical entities, and how far can you get away from observation and experiment? How far can you stretch this notion of in principle? Now, I'd like to just take as an example one of the things that's going on in contemporary physics, and that's the talk of many universes. You'll find that a lot of cosmologists are suggesting that, in fact, perhaps because of inflation, which is the current fashionable view, for which there's some experimental evidence, that because of that, it's reasonable to think that not only is this universe far bigger even than we can ever possibly observe, but that there are many other universes. Indeed, in one book, let me just take this as an example, this came out this year by a physicist called Max Tegmark, called Our Mathematical Universe. And he there wants to say, well, he distinguishes between 4 kinds of many universes. Now, the argument is that, is there such a thing as the multiverse? In other words, not just the universe we observe, not just the universe we're a part of, subject to the physical laws we're familiar with, but many other different kinds of universes. And he goes very far out. He says that he wants to assert that all the mathematical structures that can exist out there in a physical sense. And he talks about one level, just meaning distant regions from which light hasn't yet had time to reach us. He talks of another level of many universes where regions that are forever unreachable exist, but they're unreachable because of cosmological inflation of intervening space. He talks of another series of many worlds which derive from quantum mechanics, non-communicating parts, the subject's technical, the Hilbert space of quantum mechanics, lots of parallel universes of which we can have no contact, and then he launches out into his favourites, parallel universes which dance to the tunes of different equations corresponding to different mathematical structures. So this is a multiverse where all mathematical possibilities exist. Now, let me just stress that. What he's saying is that all things that are possible mathematically are realized physically. There is a kind of philosophical argument behind all this. For the last 40 years or so, physicists have been concerned with something called the anthropic principle. Some of you may be, of course, very well up with this. I remember being at a Philosophy of Science Congress in the 1970s when a very famous physicist, John Archibald Wheeler, was speaking, and I had some fascinating talks of them over breakfast several days, I remember. And one of the things he said is, why is the universe as big as it is? Because we're here. And he actually wanted, he was getting pretty near an idealist view of the universe, but he certainly wanted to say that the carbon-based life of which we are a part couldn't have existed without the existence of stars, which couldn't have existed without certain time developing in the universe, etc., etc. And therefore, the whole question of human existence depended on there having been enough time, which meant the universe had to have existed as long as it did, and therefore be as large as it is. Now, since then, people have decided that the universe is even larger, that there are, in fact, a lot of other universes. And as I've said, we've just seen that Tegmark says the mathematical universe hypothesis implies that mathematical existence equals physical existence. One motive, and it's an explicit motive for physicists saying this, is that, of course, a particular reaction to the anthropic argument, which suggests that human life isn't just a kind of unnecessary byproduct in a byway of the universe, that it's somehow linked with the basic initial conditions of physical existence. One reaction to that is that this could be built up into an argument from design, and you soon can get into theology. And someone like John Polkinghorne, I think, would embrace that particular interpretation. And other people have been tempted by it. Now, of course, a lot of physicists would regard that as anathema. They don't want to get involved in theology. And yet they think that there's something here to explain. Why is it that we are made in such a way that our very existence seems entwined with the basic initial conditions, initial structures of the universe? And one answer, and you can see it coming out in Tegmark, but it comes out explicitly in others, is quite simply, well, of course we would be here. We wouldn't be in a universe we couldn't observe, so we're in the universe we can observe, but it's not surprising this universe exists because there are an infinite number of universes. I think actually the argument does only work if you say an infinite number, as Tegmark does. If you just say there are many other universes, so it's not that surprising that we're in the one we're in. I mean, we might have easily have popped up accidentally in one of them. And people like Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, would be talking about many universes. That's not an infinite number. But unless you say there's an infinite number, I think you're still faced back with the question, why is the ensemble of universes such that it contains one that contains us? That seems an unlikely action. Just saying, well, there are lots of them, doesn't explain why we're here. But of course, if you say there are an infinite number, and that in fact it's not surprising that we're here, because all possibilities exist, all mathematical structures can exist, the fact we exist shows we can exist, well, everything that can exist does exist, so that's it. There's no question. It's all arbitrary. I mean, we're just in one universe. There are many, many others. Now, I'm afraid that this is a question of time when I begin to think perhaps the verificationists weren't that wrong. Because, I mean, I don't altogether go along with them, but at any rate, if you're standing in science, as opposed to trying to do down everything else, if you stand in science, if you allow science to get too far away from observation and experiment, then you begin to wonder where you're getting. It seems to me that talk of an infinite number of universes is a prime example of metaphysics, and a metaphysics without a great deal of reason, actually. Just think, if the answer to a question is an infinite number of universes, what kind of answer is that? I mean, it's no answer at all. Why do we exist? Why does this exist? Everything that can exist exists. Well, that's to say there is no explanation. It's just a fancy way of saying there's no explanation at all. as a philosopher, I've got a hankering after Occam's razor. Get rid of superfluous entities. Now that can be dangerous because you can get rid of too many entities if they do exist. But I do think that unless we have real evidence, or could have evidence, for an infinite number of universes, and the notion of infinity is a tricky notion too, then I think we're beginning to lose any grip even on rationality itself. So what I'm really suggesting is that in some of the bounds of physics, we're getting into metaphysical realms which are pretty fanciful. Now, I'm not in a position to say there aren't an infinite number of universes or that there aren't other universes, because I don't know. But at the same time, I don't see how they as scientists can say that they are. At the best, they're extrapolating from current scientific theory to regions way beyond that theory not only can exist, can check, but could ever check. I mean, this is the worry about universes. You see, Martin Rees says, oh, well, if you're dealing with the observable universe, of course, what's observable partly depends on our technology, but it also depends on issues of expansion and contraction of the universe. And you could think that perhaps if the universe suddenly started contracting, things would come into the realm of observation that weren't there before. So therefore one can imagine that there are unobservable entities in our universe. You can imagine what it would be to observe them. It's a bit like the other side of the moon. But the fact that it's probably unlikely for anyone ever to do that, and certainly for us as humans in the next few thousand years, is a bit beside the point. But it's by stretching the notion of in principle you can understand what he means. But then he says, and he admits it's a bit of a slippery slope argument, then he says, well, of course, if you can understand that with the unobservable parts of our universe, then the same thing applies to there being other universes. But if there are other universes that are in principle unobservable, what possible scientific reason can there be for talking of their existence? Now, people might produce fancy theories for talking about things that are totally unobservable. String theory is one of the contemporary fashionable theories, which is very divisive among scientists, actually, but particularly because it starts talking about multiple dimensions that are unobservable. And I think a lot of scientists would say, if you get too far away from observation and experiment, and too theoretical, in a way that you can never check, at what point does this stop being science? And I think some of the things going on at the moment have stopped being science, and just because they're theoretically, I suppose, talking about something that's physical, doesn't mean that they aren't actually metaphysical statements. They're certainly not grounded in current science. And indeed, the notion of the physical is beginning to get very, very attenuated, because what's physical is what we understand according to contemporary physics. But in many of these other universes, physical constants will be different, physical laws will be different, physics will be totally different, and it won't be physics as we understand it. So again, the contact with our science has totally been lost. Now, one can talk in a speculative way, but it seems to me that in this kind of area, one's very rapidly getting to a point where you're losing a grip, a rational grip on the truth of what you're saying, and getting a bit like the squirrel going around the tree. I mean, what possible difference does it make? How can we get a grip on it? One reason for it is that it's doing down the issue of God as a designer, because it's explicitly saying there isn't a purpose, anything that can happen does happen. Well, as I've said, at any rate, that's metaphysics, it's not physics. It's talking about something that in the real sense of the term is transcendental. So from that point of view, I don't think that it's putting science in any worse position than religion. But I think actually science shouldn't just be regarded as parallel to religion. Religious faith itself, like science, needs to assume that it's concerned with an objective reality. And in that sense, I would contrast my view of religion with postmodernist theories that would just say it's a matter of what each group of people believe. I'm dead against relativism in any form. I'm against celebrating diversity as an end in itself. Diversity is a sign of, I think, that if we can't agree, that there's something wrong, that we all, or some of us, in need of greater truth. Probably we all are. But truth is there, and we can't just say, let's celebrate diversity. Isn't it wonderful that some have curry and some have chop suey? It's at that superficial level of, oh, isn't it wonderful there are different religions? The fact there are different religions is a problem, I think, not something itself ultimately to celebrate. But let me get back to science and religion. What has to be the case, I ask just now, for science to take place? Science needs to assume that there is reality. That's what I've been talking about. And I think sometimes it gets carried away and starts talking about bits of reality that are beyond its remit, strictly speaking. But science does assume two things about reality. And the word rationality points to them. That reality is such that it can be understood. In other words, that there is an inherent rationality in reality. That's not something you can take for granted. And indeed, even the fact that we're here doesn't prove very much, because we could be living in a sea of order, in an island of order, in a sea of disorder. How is it we're sure? How is it that these physicists are sure that the other side of the universe, beyond what we can ever observe, operates according to physical laws that we know? Where do these regularities come from? Why is the world reality regular? I suppose the philosophical problem of induction is bound up with this, and some empiricists want to get away from that. But I think there's a very real question here about why reality is such that it can be understood. And the other issue is, why is the reality that can be understood, in fact, able to be understood by us? In other words, it isn't just that rationality is inbuilt into reality. To use the Greek term, that there is a logos in everything. And it's not a coincidence that the beginning of John's Gospel starts with that word. But it isn't just that. It's that our human minds are attuned to that logos. Or so science has to assume. Because you can't do science unless you assume that there is something to discover, it has a regularity, and that actually we have minds that can capture it. Now, obviously what I'm beginning to point towards here is that these are issues that have their grounding in religion. That the logos inherent in everything is the reflection of God's mind. We are made in the image of God, and therefore it's not surprising that we can understand that reality. It was said earlier that this is Darwin's college. Just a couple of hundred yards down the road is Emmanuel College. If you go into the chapel there and look at the stained glass, there are various Cambridge Platonists commemorated. It was one of the centres of Cambridge Platonism, which was the philosophy, the theology that was prevalent in the late 17th century in Cambridge, and in fact was the background against which people like Newton did their science. The Royal Society was founded in part by others as well, but by people who were influenced by Cambridge Platonism. One of the authors of some of the views was Benjamin Whichcote, and he's commemorated in the stained glass of Emmanuel. And his motto, and it's there in Latin in the stained glass, is that reason is the candle of the Lord. It's always a lovely phrase that I like. It suggests that reason isn't a bright searchlight, it's a flickering light, so we can't hope to know everything. but it suggests that human reason is rooted in the reason of God. Now that was the motive of the early scientists, as I said, founders of the Royal Society. It actually influenced a lot of philosophy. It wasn't a coincidence that John Locke, the philosopher, used to attend Benjamin Whichcote's Church St. Lawrence Jury in London. And so the whole attitude feeds in not just to science, but to Locke's rather science-based philosophy, but people sometimes think it's more science-based than it was. It was based very firmly on an idea of, to use the title of one of his books, the reasonableness of Christianity. So science depends on a notion of the world as being regular and rational and intelligible that I think raise questions that can only be answered by religion. So far from religion itself being something that isn't rational and has to cower away from the searching light of science, religion is something that gives a ground to science. That religion is something that can justify science. Certainly, many scientists through the centuries have thought that way. And I think the dangers of not thinking that way are shown by the reaction against modernist views of science shown by postmodernism, which says, well, actually, science is just what scientists do. And you've even got anthropologists and sociologists saying, well, science is what we investigate, people in funny white coats do in funny buildings, and science is a practice like any others. It's not a body of knowledge because there is nothing to be known. There's only people knowing. That loses grip on reality. But the metaphysical grip on reality is something that you need for science to take place. And without that, science itself begins to fall to pieces. And I think with that, science and religion can see that they have a lot in common. They're both, I think, attempting to describe the same reality. Thank you.
So, are there people that would like to ask Roger questions tonight? Are you going to try the microphone?
I think it may magically be working.
Yes, great. Okay, right at the back.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your lovely presentation there. I don't know if there's, one of the statements you made that really troubled me, got me thinking, was you have a problem with diversity in religions. And my question is, if the diversity in religions is a problem to you, how do you objectively prove the truth of one religion? Doesn't he attempt to turn religion into a science?
Right. Perhaps I ought to admit that, of course, the book that I've just written is called Religious Diversity, so you'll get me onto a subject that I can be talking about for a very long time. I mean, that was just a sentence pointing to a very long argument. Of course, I do think that there is a truth to be discovered in the realm of religion, and I think that religions are all about finding out that truth. When they disagree, one can't just say, oh, let's just celebrate the difference. One can respect the difference, respect the people who disagree, but they think that actually that shows there's something further to be found out. Now, whether one day they all converge or not, I don't think they can, because they're actually contradicting each other sometimes. I mean, Jesus can't both be and not be the Son of God. One of the things in my book that I've been dead against is the kind of theological approach, and you've certainly had it in Christianity, which wants to water down the claims of Christianity to make them less controversial for people who aren't Christians. I don't think it impresses non-Christians. I think they expect Christians to believe in Christianity. But for instance, the kind of people who would say, well, Jesus wasn't really the Son of God, that's, to use a technical word, myth. So they talk about the myth of God incarnate. So we're not really saying anything that is in their face to Muslims. I mean, Muslims ought to, but of course Muslims won't accept it anyway. But but they're trying to water down the differences. I think we've got to face the differences honestly, respect the differences, but still think there is a truth to be discovered. If there isn't, you see, what worries me is if you give up on truth, if I say, well, I'm not saying something that I believe to be true. If I am saying it, then they ought to believe it even if they don't. But if I'm not saying something I believe to be true, why should I go on believing it myself? And I think that's a very real question. Unless I really believe it's true, there's no point in going on believing it. Now, I'm not here, because what worries people is what's commonly called fundamentalism, the kind of people who want to say, we're right, you're wrong, etc., etc. And by saying there is a truth, I try also to say that humility is a virtue, that actually one can learn from others as well as teach them. But one shouldn't lose grip on the fact that it all matters. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Peter.
You've read Tegmark's recent book.
Right.
Now, there are many ways that mathematicians construct different forms of mathematics, and you can construct different forms of logic. It all depends on what axioms you propose and what the laws of deduction are. There's also Gödel's theorem. So does he take this sort of thing into account, or is his statement simply a glib statement?
Well, I think it's pretty glib, but I mean, one of the issues that he's dealing with is what is the relationship between mathematics and reality, and why is it that reality and maths do fit each other? Now, this is something that I think is a very big issue for all physicists or scientists, and you see, a lot of physicists have commented on how extraordinary it is that maths somehow does fit onto the world. It's very peculiar if you think, I mean, mathematics is an odd discipline, and if you can think of people just scribbling up on blackboards or whiteboards or whatever they do nowadays, and these squiggles somehow uncover the secrets of the world. Now, I'm not actually exaggerating there. I mean, you can actually, therefore, from maths, discover, it seems, something about the world. Now, Tegmark is taking that extremely seriously. He's saying whatever maths says has a counterpart in reality. And that's a big metaphysical claim. I mean, it's like Pythagoras, really, that reality is basically mathematical in structure.
And my question was that it's all very well to talk about maths, but that is not a very well-defined set, as it were, because of the many different ways that mathematicians define mathematics. And I wonder how far he goes to think about that. He may not say, of course.
I think he's rather thinking that how he does maths reflects the way the world is. But, I mean, it's a fair point that there are different mathematics, and just as there are different geometries. I think you could begin to say, well, are there different kinds of multiverses reflecting what? And that begins to expose the peculiarities of what he's saying, I think. Yes, Ronnie.
Well, just to add to that, I mean, the point about Gödel's theorem is that any mathematical system as or more complicated than arithmetic has statements within it that cannot be proved algorithmically, that are truths that we as humans can perceive, that can't be proved algorithmically. Now, so I suppose the question is, if you're on from that, doesn't that mean that physical theories are inevitably incomplete themselves, because they're based on mathematics, which is incomplete?
Yeah, and I think that would be a fair point. And I mean, certainly, well, I think that the incompleteness of physical theory is something, in a sense, I've been arguing for, because I believe it has to have philosophical and metaphysical justification.
Another question?
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the realist aspect of nature. I mean, my understanding as a total layperson is that mathematics can be understood both as a realist science and as a non-realist science, something that people invent or discover. So tied to that, I mean, we can clearly see every discipline in terms of being a people sort of thing. How do you put metaphysics above that? I mean, isn't metaphysics a people thing as well, fundamentally?
Well, of course, what I'm trying to say is that all human activity presupposes that there is a reality that isn't, in your words, a people thing. It isn't just a reflection of what people believe or a construction out of our thoughts. We actually have to think that there is a reality that we're trying to discover. An analogy, I'm no great footballer, but an analogy might be having a game of football, or as my American grandson would say, soccer, having a game of that, and actually playing it without any goals. I mean, taking reality out, it's just people milling around on the pitch. What is it all about? Where are you aiming at? And unless you have a notion of a reality that you're aiming at, I think it's very, very difficult then to give any purpose or structure to what one is doing. Of course, postmodernism is a people thing. Relativism is a people thing. What they're saying is that different beliefs, different societies, different groups create different truths, and what's true is what's true for them. But I don't suppose you're going down the relativist path. I hope not. Anyway.
No, but I was thinking more in terms of Kant, because Kant was talking
yes.
about how everything is to do with our own mental structures, really, isn't it? I mean, that's...
He did, of course, think that there were things in themselves, but the trouble about that is, if he thought they were inaccessible, it was very easy for the next generation of philosophers to cut that out and say, well, we'll just deal with phenomena, not with what Kant calls noumena, the things that are to be thought of as in themselves. So, certainly I would argue against Kant. I mean, he's making reality almost by definition inaccessible, but not as a transcendental argument. I mean, he was using a bit the same kind of argument I was just using, of, not in terms of football, but in terms of a goal, that, I mean, without the idea of there being something that you're talking about, everything falls to pieces. Certainly I think language does. Unless you think there is a reality that you're talking about, what's the point of language? Plato was quite firm about this, that in the end you couldn't teach or learn language, it was just a series of noise, unless you could assume there was a common reality we all faced, and you could teach a child that that is a cat. Or you can't assume, if you don't think that the cat is there for the child in the same way it's there for you, there's no commonality. And therefore objectivity is in a sense a precondition of language.
Can I ask you?
Yeah, of course, yes.
I don't mean this to sound flippant, although it may do, but when you were talking about the Vienna School,
yeah,
in particular, and logical positivism, what did they make of falling in love?
I didn't, well, the only one I knew was Eyre, who seemed to fall in love with a great number of women in the world. He was a bit like Bertrand Russell. He wreaked havoc amongst a lot of lives, I think. And I used to see him walking through the quadrangle in New College with different women, and I'm sure his wife didn't know, or the wife of the moment. But didn't seem to stop him.
All the sort of things that you
But don't forget, no, but don't forget that they didn't deny the existence of emotions. Right. I mean, they had what was called the emotive theory of ethics, which is roughly saying stealing, woo, or love, hooray. But that was just emotion. Right. And of course that had the wonderful result that ethics is itself an emotional reaction to things, and that's just a fact about you. They can't be criticised. So Eyre had built a series of ethics, a theory of ethics, according to which he couldn't be criticised for adultery. I mean, if that's the way his emotions said, then fine. And that, I suppose, in a way, it fitted a particular worldview, really, that they didn't want external constraints on behaviour. I mean, I sometimes think that a lot of this sex is driving it, even in the deepest philosophies. So you just wonder sometimes what's going on. Still. But there's no doubt that logical positivism was slightly curious. I remember once I was driving down to Oxford and stopped for a cup of tea in Woodstock, and there was a very nosy old lady at the table who wanted to know where I was going and why, And I said that I was going to a lecture and on philosophy, and she said, "Oh, my nephew is a philosopher in Oxford." And I said, "Oh yes," and she told me his name, and I didn't know him vaguely. And then she said with piercingly, "He's a logical positivist." And I said, "Yes, that was a fair description." And she looked at me, and that wasn't the right reaction. She said, "It's not very nice, is it?"
Are there any more questions? Yes.
You spoke about reality and that it's independent, right? And there is this big problem in quantum physics about the observer and the fact if something exists until it is observed or not. So how does it is related to what you said?
Well, of course, I mean, a lot of what I'm saying does get focused on how you interpret quantum mechanics. And there is a kind of quasi-verificationist way of doing it, which all just links it to the measurement apparatus or the observer. I mentioned Wheeler, the physicist, who wanted to actually in a sense, relate reality to the capacity to be observed, and he had quantum mechanics in mind, that the collapse of the wave function involving observers is the moment at which reality itself comes into being. And of course, there are some people in quantum mechanics who want to, Everett was one, who wants to talk about the many worlds interpretations of every time that some of these things are happening, the world splits. I mean, it seems to me totally outrageous that you're talking about, again, Tegmark talks about it, talking about multiple worlds and multiple copies of myself and all the rest of it. And it just seems just reality gone mad. So I do think that there is a reality, even at subatomic level. But, and of course the point is, it's not like classical reality. It's not like, I mean, there are not lots of little objects like big objects, only little. It behaves very differently. And I think that's part of the problem. And also that it's very difficult to observe without interfering it. I mean, that's part of the technological problem. So, I mean, there is a lot of the problem. I mean, one of the big main interpretations of which I suppose is still favoured very much is the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. And Niels Bohr is often thought to be putting forward a view that isn't particularly realist. I remember years ago, it was the 100th anniversary of his birth, I think, and this was more than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and I went to an event to celebrate this in London, and they were talking very learnedly all day about how far you could talk about the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and what Niels Bohr thought and all the rest of it. And at the end of the day, one man put up his hand and said, and nobody knew who he was, he suddenly said, "Niels Bohr was my father." And he then went on to tell us how he was a realist, and he just said what his father thought, and that was the end of that conference, because nobody dared to say anything after that. But I was very interested that he did think his father was a realist. But of course, I mean, the catch might be a realist about what? At what level? Was he a realist about everything, even at the subatomic level, or just at the classical level? I mean, you've still got that to be resolved.
I have one more question. And you spoke about physicalism, right?
Yes.
And anthropocentric perspective. And I think it was Roger Penrose who said that the solution of mind and how it works is on quantum level, and on quantum theory level, I don't remember exactly, and that physics is going to explain how the mind or how the brain works.
Well, I mean, that's part of a physicalist view. It's something that I suppose, again, you could work towards. We mentioned Gödel's theorem. I think that you're always going to come up against insuperable objects, that it's always the mind of the scientist working out how the mind works. So there's an element of self-reference coming in here. And I think you'll never actually objectify everything completely. It's a bit like saying, can you draw a picture of the room including you drawing a picture of the room? And you can never quite catch up with it. It's self-referential in almost a dangerous way. And so I think that there are quite great problems. I mean, neurophysiologists, of course, would like to think they can explain everything, but at the same time as explaining the working of the brain, they presumably have to explain their explaining of the working of the brain. And I do feel that there is a great problem there. I mean, actually, if you just want my opinion, I don't think you can ever do that, because I don't think you can reduce the mind to the brain. That's another issue.
Might we hear more on that tomorrow afternoon?
Not quite, no. I mean, partly. I mean, I'm willing to talk about it, but it's...
Do you think in that case there is no unified understanding of reality, that we're always going to be condemned to seeing things in discontinued areas such as science and subjective experience, for example, and so on?
Well, I don't think you can reduce subjective experience to something that's explained scientifically. I mean, that's one thing. So there's always the world as we see it, and the world as it is in itself. Subjective experience is part of the world in a way, but it is... my pain, which I feel, is a reality, but it isn't the same as just the firing of neurons or something like that. It's something much more than that. So it's... I mean, there was a very famous philosophical article, of course, what is it like to be a bat? And we can never know, really. But there is something that is like to be a human, and science can never quite capture that. Because, don't forget, science is itself the product of the human mind. It's itself the product of human reason. So it will never explain the workings of human reason totally, because to do so it will be explaining itself. And we're back with this self-referential issue. I don't think it will ever catch up with itself. I mean, you're putting your finger on, of course, of something that people do hanker after, which is, in a sense, putting everything in the same category. And they want to say, well, everything is physics, or everything is this, or everything is that. And there may be more than one kind of reality that can't be reduced to the other kind. I mean, why not say that there is mind and matter, or spirit and matter, or something like that?
Precisely because mind has got to inhere in matter. I mean, we are fundamentally dependent upon the physical world, and everything else we have comes from it. There is a natural connection.
Yeah, but can we exist apart from the physical world? I mean, that's an interesting question. I remember that the philosopher Quine said that you see, there are different attitudes to ghosts. I've come across scientists who say the reason that they're materialists is they want to say there are no ghosts. Quine, who was himself a self-styled naturalist, said that he thought one day science would be able to explain ghosts. But I suppose there would be another possibility that actually there are such things as ghosts, but they can't be explained scientifically. There's another kind of explanation. I don't know where one would go on that. But they're all rather a priori views. I mean, to say what can or can't exist, or what can and can't be explained, is going out on a limb a bit.
I'm sure we could get that mathematician to prove that, couldn't we?
What, that there are ghosts?
No, that we could exist outside of this reality. Who was that mathematician?
Tegmark?
Yeah.
Yeah, that we could exist. Well, I don't know if we could exist outside the reality we're in, but there are all kinds of other kinds of reality, every conceivable thing could exist, but we're probably linked to the kind of reality we're in, because that's us. But I mean, certainly all possibilities exist. I mean, goodness knows. I mean, I suppose he could allow lots of possibilities, but he would be pretty physically based, I think. Yes.
Dr. Trigg, you're saying
Sorry.
that...
There have
Oh,
been
sorry.
people that have had
I'm
their
sorry.
hands up.
Oh,
so
right.
the guy here with the scarf, could you
Right.
pass the microphone forward? Then we'll go back to Abbas, and then we'll come to you.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture, in my opinion. And I'm a philosophy and theology student, so I know some things about science, but obviously that's not my domain. But this is more question more about agendas and maybe cultural issues. if many of us in this room, and I'm sure elsewhere, can see your viewpoint, and I think, in my humble opinion, it is absolutely correct, self-referentialism, science is making non-scientific statements and yet insisting that it is actually a statement of science when to many people it's obvious that it is not, including some great scientists like Stephen Hawking, etc. in the first chapter, which Professor John Lennox, I think, wrote a very nice small book which I think shredded his opinion to pieces, at least the non-physical part of it. And the fact that for some strange reason yet to be explained by anyone, mathematics actually describes reality, etc., etc. So don't you think it's some sort of a cultural agenda or maybe a sociological agenda which somehow appeared within the last 2 centuries, and it's actually something artificially constructed and pushed by certain movements, forces, or whatever you call them? Thank you.
Yes, no, I think that's a fair point. I could have, well, I will now, distinguish between 2 phases of enlightenment, or 2 different kinds of enlightenment. There is the early Enlightenment, as exemplified by the Cambridge Platonists, and Newton, and Locke, and people like that, who are stressing the role of reason, and human reason. I mean, that's terribly important. But they're not suggesting that reason is antithetical to religion. In fact, they're saying that reason emanates from a belief in God, because God is rational, God is logos. So you've got that. But then you've got the 18th century French Enlightenment, which became much more materialist than it was associated with the French Revolution and so on. And then the people got very explicitly materialist. And the word rationalist, you notice, has over the years become almost synonymous with atheist. And they've taken over the notion of reason. And the materialism of the 18th century, which insisted that science was the only expression of human reason, became very dominant. And I mean, politically, this has its effects nowadays, culturally in Europe, because France certainly would, for instance, would have no truck in the Lisbon Treaty with saying that even there was a Christian heritage for Europe, because they operate a policy of laicite, of secularism, and they don't therefore want anything to do with religion. Again, it's part of the privatization of religion I was mentioning. And that's a very different attitude from the American attitude, where they talk about the separation of church and state, certainly, but they are very much linked with John Locke. And there's a very close connection, I think, with some of the thoughts that came even from the city and then influenced the New World and America. The founder of Harvard went from Emmanuel. And you find then that there, the idea of reason was not opposed to religion. And even people like Jefferson, who wasn't a particularly conventional Christian, but nevertheless was in fact not ruling out religion in public life. And that there was a space for religion in public life in America that there wasn't in Europe. And I think the difference is just a difference of views of the Enlightenment. That in one, reason is anchored in a religious view of the world, and the other, it's an anti-religious view. So there are very deep cultural differences there, which you actually can see being played out politically nowadays, and even in the law. And the question is religion something that can be dealt with rationally or not? Yes.
Going back to first of all, thank you for the very good presentation. It was brilliant. Going back to that point where science cannot catch up with the real world or cannot explain everything on that whole self-referencing argument, does the fact that science can't explain everything enough, is that fact alone enough to completely disregard this usefulness in explaining reality? I mean, Gödel has been mentioned earlier. There's also Heisenberg, who put some limitation on our on how much we can know simultaneously about the world, but far from being a hindrance, it actually gave us a better understanding of what's going on at a quantum level. So what I want to know is the fact that science can't explain everything enough to disregard its usefulness in explaining reality.
Is it enough to disregard what? Sorry?
Its usefulness in explaining reality.
No, obviously, science is tremendously important in telling us about reality, but it can't explain everything about reality. All I'm saying is that science is one path to reality, but it isn't the only path. It hasn't a monopoly. But it's certainly, and this is why I'm dead against postmodernism, which undermines science as a source of knowledge. Science is a very important source of human knowledge, but it's not the only source, and it may itself, for its success, need to depend on other understandings of human rationality. That's all I'm saying. But I don't want to undermine insights from science, which can be very, very important.
Okay, we'll have a last question here. You can use the microphone.
Thank you. My question rose when your answer to the lady to my right here, I'd never realized until you said this, and I'm just wanting to know if this is correct. There's a lot of supervenience arguments with regard to everything supervening upon the physical. And are you saying, I think you're saying, that supervenience itself has epistemological or philosophical pre-commitments that cause us to argue for that, and that one ought to think in a larger or outside of the box of supervenience?
Yes. I don't like the word supervenience. I have a feeling that it's wanting to dodge important philosophical issues by putting together things that you can't really put together. This supervenes on that. It's a way of getting around arguments about dualism, for instance, by trying to have your cake and eat it. And I never actually, and the word has been around since the 1960s, I've never quite understood what's meant by supervenience. And I say that in the old Oxford philosophical sense, where people used to go when I was young to seminars and say, I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean by such and such. And it was never an expression of ignorance. It was always a downright attack. And you're confused, it meant. It didn't mean I'm ignorant.
Okay, I think on that note, we're going to say thank you again very much to Roger.